Well, hello and welcome back for our lecture on depressants and inhalants. We'll start today by taking a look at our goals. As we go through our lecture today, we'll be talking about several examples of depressant drugs and the behavioral effects that they cause. We'll also be talking about how our historical class of depressants, barbiturates, led to the development and acceptance of new groups of sedatives and hypnotics. We'll talk about how the time of onset for a depressant drug relates to its potential for abuse and how its duration of action relates to its risk for withdrawal symptoms. And then we'll also talk about how sleeping pills are typically how they function and why it's not recommended to use them for more than a few days in a row. Finally, we'll wrap up with a couple of types of substances that are abused as inhalants, and we'll spend a little bit of time talking about GHB as well. So when we talk about depressants, we're used to hearing of those as the opposite of stimulants, and we'll talk about them that same way here in health studies of dangerous drugs. So while stimulants got the central nervous system revved up or amped up, depressants will decrease the amount of activity in the central nervous system, and they have that effect throughout the brain. They do have that widespread effect of decreasing activity. As a group, they're also called sedative hypnotics instead of depressants. And although we're used to thinking of sedatives as something that would cause sleep, in this sense, we're talking about them as being used to treat anxiety, while the medications that treat insomnia we'd refer to as hypnotics. Widely used depressants here in the United States in the 21st century include alcohol and also BZDs or benzodiazepines, a class of prescription drugs. So before our modern group of depressants, the barbiturates, there were depressants that were used in previous centuries, and including alcohol. But some that you may be less familiar with include chloral hydrate, paraldehyde, and bromides. So if you ever heard of knockout drops or the idea of a Mickey Finn adding something to someone's drink in a bar, the concerns that we have about GHB and similar drugs in the modern era, chloral hydrate was their precursor. It could be added to a drink in a bar, and it would induce sleep in less than an hour. There were some definite side effects, typically gastric irritation with repeated use. And then paraldehyde, another drug that was used as a depressant during that same time period. It was relatively safe, but it was difficult to consume. It had a noxious taste and a bad smell that people really didn't like. And then bromides, when we talked about those patent medicines that people could manufacture in their backyard and sell for whatever they thought they would improve, bromides were a typical ingredient of those patent medicines. And actually, they remained in use in over-the-counter drugs here in the United States through the 1960s. But they definitely had some side effects which were concerning, including bioaccumulation and the possibility of toxic side effects. So these weren't clearly not a very satisfactory group of choices. And then at the beginning of the 20th century, we saw the advent of barbiturates. So these were first introduced in 1903, and they were very, very popular and useful. And we actually saw over 2,500 examples that were synthesized, different kinds of barbiturates for different uses. Some popular ones, if you're familiar with the names, include phenobarbital and secobarbital. And the way that we group this class of drugs depends on the time of onset, or the amount of time that it takes to start feeling the effects, and then duration of activity, or how long they last. Typically, we'll see short-acting, rapid onset drugs used to induce sleep, and these are usually prescribed at higher doses to have that effect. And then we'll see longer-acting and delayed onset drugs used to reduce anxiety, and for those we'll usually see a lower dose. So let's talk a little bit about what we mean when we talk about short-acting. So if you think about maybe having insomnia, having difficulty falling asleep, and the way that you'd like your medication to work. You'd like to be able to fall asleep quickly, not lie there for several hours waiting for it to take effect. And then you'd also like it to wear off relatively quickly so that when you wake up in the morning, you're ready to function. And that's what we describe as a short-acting barbiturate. Examples here include pentobarbital and secobarbital. Basically, they start to work within about 15 minutes, and they would last for about 2 to 3 hours. So ideally, you'd be able to fall asleep under the influence of the drug, but then when you woke up in the morning, you would not be feeling its effects any longer. We have a group in the middle called intermediate-acting barbiturates, that would take about half an hour to get started, and they'd last for about 5 to 6 hours. And then the longer-acting barbiturates, like phenobarbital, it would take about an hour to start feeling the effects, and those effects would last for 8 hours or longer. Now, we do have some concerns about the use of barbiturates. and these included overdose deaths, both intentional and accidental, so used for suicide, and then accidental deaths from overdose after barbiturate use. And basically the way this works is that the central nervous system becomes so depressed that the body no longer breathes involuntarily. So respiratory depression, the systems just get slowed down to the point where death occurs because the body is no longer breathing. We also saw risks for abuse and dependence. We know that when we look at when a drug has reinforcing effects, it's usually related to how quickly those effects begin, so that those short-acting barbiturates are more likely to lead to dependence than the intermediate or longer-acting drugs. And because of these risks, we started to look for some safer depressants that we could use for sleep and for anxiety. And one example of this is mepebromate. So this was widely prescribed beginning in the 1950s, and this was a drug that was designed to reduce anxiety, not one of the sleep aids or hypnotics. But it was not as safe as we were hoping. It could produce both psychological and physical dependence. It is still available by prescription. It has not been completely replaced, but largely replaced by that newer class of BZDs or benzodiazepines. Another depressant, methaqualone. This one actually is probably more commonly known by its street name of Quaaludes. And this one was introduced in the US in 1965, even though it was already causing trouble in other countries. At the time that it was released, the packaging information that went with it basically said that they didn't know what was going to happen next, that its addiction potential had not been established, and it was pretty widely overprescribed by physicians who thought that the drug would be a safe alternative. And you're probably familiar with its history of pretty broad misuse and abuse. And we actually saw that make it onto the federal schedule, Schedule 2 in 1973 and Schedule 1 in 1985. So no longer prescribed for any health reasons here in the United States. So the one that most of us are probably most familiar with here from the group of drugs in this category would be benzodiazepines or BZDs. The first BZD was introduced in 1960, Librium, and it was the first one that was commercially marketed. And basically, this drug was able to reduce anxiety without inducing sleep. So it could lower anxiety levels without making a person sleepy. And it was much safer than barbiturates. It rarely caused physical dependence. And really the only time that we saw overdose with Librium was when it was combined with another depressant like alcohol. So very successful compared to some of the previous drugs. And then in the 1970s, we saw the introduction of Valium, another drug from this class, which eventually became the bestseller among all prescription drugs at the time. So while they are much safer than previous depressants, dependence and overdose can still occur. And again, we're looking at those two factors, the dose level and the time course, to figure out how dangerous that dose can be. So the overdose is going to be much more likely for drugs that are sold at higher doses. It just kind of makes sense. And then again, psychological dependence, that rapid onset is a risk factor. For physical dependence, that's going to be much more likely for drugs with a short duration of action. So start feeling that physical absence of the drug and feel the craving to reintroduce it to your body. So we come down to this question, whether benzodiazepines are safer than barbiturates. And what we're going to find actually is it's not really whether the two classes of drugs have those broad distinctions, but really it's whether drugs within each class. So there are benzodiazepines that are much safer than other benzodiazepines, and then barbiturates that are much safer than other barbiturates. So it's difficult to draw distinctions between the two classes, but it's easy to draw distinctions between drugs within each group. So one benzodiazepines that people in college tend to be familiar with is Rohypnol or roofies. So we talked about that idea of a Mickey Finn, something that could be added to a drink in a bar. And this is one that we saw begin to become used in that setting in the 1990s. So Rohypnol is a depressant, and when mixed with alcohol, it has a multiplicative effect. So it causes very profound intoxication. And we see its use being reported, of course, as a date rape drug, where it's slipped into drinks in public settings, and then the effects can be very devastating, of course. So in 1997, any Rohypnol that was legally manufactured had a change in formulation. So if it was dissolved in a drink containing alcohol, it would have a very distinctive color. which would be great, of course, if all Rohypnol was legally manufactured. We do have a couple of other non-benzodiazepine hypnotics to talk about. There's one category called the Z drugs. They're very similar to benzodiazepines in their use and function, but they have a different chemical structure. And Ambien is actually one of these. And that when we talk about Z drugs, we've got names starting with Z's, including zolpidem. So zolpidem, the trade name Ambien, became the most widely prescribed hypnotic or sleep aid after its introduction. And what, of course, like what we're looking for a sleep aid, it's got that short duration and rapid onset. And initially, we thought it would be safer than BZDs. It seemed to be a safer, again, another safer alternative. We look at that progression from barbiturates to benzodiazepines. The Z drugs were supposed to be the next class. But we do see some reporting of withdrawal symptoms for drugs in this category. Okay, we're going to wrap it up for our first mini lecture here, and we'll be looking at the mechanism of action next.